This week on Between the Links, where does Valentina Shevchenko go after her win over Liz Carmouche in the main event of UFC Uruguay? Also, what a co-main event we saw between Vicente Luque and Mike Perry. Whose stock rose more, Luque's with the win or Perry's with the loss? We look ahead to UFC 241 and what is at stake besides the heavyweight title between Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic. Is Saturday a must-win for the returning Nate Diaz against Anthony Pettis? All that and much more coming up tonight on Between the Links. All right, welcome to a brand new episode of Between the Links on the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network. My name is Mike Heck. I'm your host, the man trying to keep this panel in line today, and it's not going to be easy as we have a lot to get to on this Monday night. UFC 241 is coming up on Saturday. The UFC was in Montevideo on Saturday for an interesting card. There's lots to discuss, and joining me in this venture is, of course, the panel. And introducing first, the man who put his entire game on the line last week with an out-of-the-box answer. When I asked for the storyline of the weekend, he picked the preseason debut of Tom Brady, and he got booted from the show. And as it turns out, it was the right call because Brady didn't even take a single snap on Thursday. Did he, Keith Schillen? Welcome back.
No, listen, I knew I was getting eliminated. It's like, do I really want to talk to Davison anymore in the finals? Like, I knew Tom Brady's in his 20th season. Do you think I knew that he wasn't going to play? I was like, yeah, I'm out of here. I don't want to talk about freaking UFC Uruguay. So, yeah, that's it. I'm out of here.
So you just eliminated yourself. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, pretty much. I did it for my own sanity. But, hey, you can check out all my writings at Sherdog, K-Side Press, Fansided, and I do some shows here on the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network.
I was just going to say, since you're probably not going to make it to the finals, you might as well plug your stuff now. Mr. Davidson Baker is back on the program. I know he is ready to rock and roll. How are you, Davidson?
Doing well. Thank you very much. I must say, even though I tuned into the Patriots and Lions game myself, I just did it to check out if Matt Patricia's pencil ear gig looked as clear as it needs to be. Tom Brady did not take a single snap, just like you said he would not. My question to you, though, Mike, you taking Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady with your first quarterback?
Like for fantasy football?
Yes.
Oh, Mahomes all day.
Okay. That's all I wanted to do.
But if it's, me starting an organization and I want to win a Super Bowl, I mean, it's a tough argument.
Tom Brady.
I'm going with Brady. I'm going with the guy who's been there so many times at this point, but we could talk about this forever and ever. We have Canada's own Gregory Allen. Craig, any social media insults of note you'd like to share with the public?
Listen, man, got none this week, actually. There wasn't positive energy. There wasn't negative energy. There's nothing bad said on social media about any of the 2-minute breakdowns. We went 5 for 6. That wasn't too bad. But you can find all of those episodes, fightnightpicks.net, Fight Night Picks on YouTube. Had Davidson Baker, the one and only, last night to do a weekend recap. And we had a lot of fun there. We went all the way through UFC Uruguay. And listen, if you didn't get bored by the fights, you can get bored by us talking about the fights. So maybe check that out if you get the chance. Maybe if you've got a free hour and a half to hear about those fights, just go have a look.
Is Davidson going to get one of those pink T-shirts that you're wearing for appearing on the show?
Listen, I mean, you never know. Like, I just basically have this song playing all the time, just the straight, Miami Vice Fight Night Pick shirts. But maybe if you come on the show, you might get a T-shirt. You never know.
Well, hopefully you don't get kicked off of YouTube for that, but I think you played just enough. And as always, we like to round out the panel each week with a very special guest. This week is no different, as we're being joined by a man who's doing incredible work for MMA Junkie with his breakdowns, his prospects grades, and I love his post-contender series grades as well. He is also the host of the Protect Your Neck podcast. He was also co-host of MMA Junkie Radio, and then all of a sudden we just found out that we don't know what's going on with MMA Junkie Radio. How are you, Dan?
Hey, what's going on? Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me, Mike, and it's good, of course, to see familiar faces from John Davidson or faces I haven't seen before, like Craig and so forth. And there's Keith, of course. We'll just leave that there. But no, it's an honor to be on here, especially on this show because again, safety's off. You got to come on hot, and I appreciate the work you guys do.
Mr. Dan Tom, appreciate you joining the program. And for a full list of rules, head back to the archives. You can find them there. The rebuttal rule, as always, is in effect. So here we go. The main event over the weekend at the aforementioned UFC Uruguay card saw Valentina Shevchenko defeat Liz Carmouche in a fight that was never in any real doubt. A unanimous decision victory for the bullet, and she retains her women's flyweight title. Now, although the win was one-sided in comparison to the win over Jessica Ai, there wasn't a lot of highlight reels or anything like that. Of course, in the Ai fight, she had one of the most brutal knockouts you'll ever see in a women's fight. But Shevchenko continues on, and the question has been kind of out there in the MMA universe for a while. Is the gap between Valentina Shevchenko and the rest of the division just so gaping, just so big, that it almost doesn't matter who she fights at this point? It's just going to be a foregone conclusion that she'll win. But it is a fight, and anything can happen. Who knows the answer to this point? But with the fine line between sport, meritocracy, and entertainment, the question is, to start things off, what is next, or what should be next for Valentina Shevchenko after her win over Liz Carmouche on Saturday? And since Keith won the random draw today, we're going to start with you, sir.
Well, I'll start with what shouldn't be, and it's what a lot of people are calling for, is Amanda Nunes fight. I don't get why people are asking for that. Luckily, Shevchenko addressed that on the post-fight show and said that she won't leave the division until her sister is number one contender in the division. Listen, why it shouldn't be the Amanda Nunes super fight? It's already 2-0 for Amanda. Why would Amanda do that fight? I mean, it makes nothing for her. I mean, it's not a trilogy fight when someone's up 2-0. It also holds up not one, not two, but three out of four divisions in the women's. And the last one is their last fight was absolutely terrible. Does no one remember that their second fight was extremely boring? It actually looked a lot like the fight we just saw against Liz Carmouche. Now, who should it be? Unfortunately, it's like, picking the tallest midget. I mean, it's Caitlin Chikagian. That was who they tried booking in the first place. She turned the fight down because she was getting married or something. But what happened is, and she's won 4 out of 5, and I mean, she probably deserved it. But really what they should do is focus not on who it should be, but where. It should be in Kyrgyzstan or wherever the heck that country
10
is.
seconds.
Where Shevchenko is from. She's a star there. Get her in the main event. And then the next thing they should focus on is not who she beats, but the record should go. And she should be focused on DJ's record and trying to break that and being that dominant champion.
All right, David. So what do you think? What should be next for Valentina Shevchenko?
I think it depends on a couple of things. First of all, though, I think the road by the UFC, or better yet, the road they're trying to set for Valentina Shevchenko going forward, at this point, kind of seems as clear as day, them booking Jessica Ai and Viviane Araújo, who, while I might be in the minority, I contend as an interesting matchup. Not someone that could beat Valentina, in my opinion, but someone that would give her an interesting stylistic look. They book her against Jessica Ai for Vegas later this year. I think the UFC is clearly trying to set these contenders up to get knocked down one by one, per se, or to, kind of fast track Valentina to quick turnarounds. They obviously have a card coming up in Madison Square Garden where a Caitlin Chikagian fight would make a lot of sense. They're going to need multiple title fights on that card. It would seem like that's the most logical thing to do if they want to continue to rack up title defenses for Shevchenko in the moment. And I do agree with Keith. There's no need to do the Nunes fight again.
10 seconds.
Especially given the fact that Nunes is going to be busy for a while too. Omit Cyborg out of the picture. Durandamy stared her in the face. Who knows who she'll defend at 145 next? I think Valentina will have to stay home and just knock a couple out of the park.
Craig Allen, take a shot of ranch and give us your take on this.
I mean, realistically, Davidson brought up a really good point. Araújo taking on Ai, that's set for December. So we got a long time before we have that fight. Maybe a possible number one contender emerges out of that fight. But for the time being, you have to look at the number 2 spot in Caitlin Chikagian. And you look at her UFC record, she's 5-2 so far. The 2 losses are both split decisions to the former title challengers, both of them that we've just had in Carmouche and Ai. So you look at that, you have to consider the fact that Chikagian's kind of from close by as well. And yeah, I mean, she hasn't finished a fight since 2016, but it's probably the best of the worst, so to speak, the outcome that's probably most likely. And it's just a real shame because you look at probably the second best UFC or rather women's flyweight out there. She was in attendance. She was actually in the cage during this fight. That was Aleem McFarlane in the corner of Liz Carmouche. And it was kind of weird, the corner advice we were getting, the fact that Carmouche's corner kept saying, you're ahead, you're winning these rounds. It was an odd fight to begin with, but McFarlane would be a great fight. Realistically, we're going to get Chikagian just due to the fact that that's the most likely outcome here.
I mean, Dan, Chikagian makes all the sense in the world. I mean, she's kind of next in line, but again, we're in this world of, the line between sports and entertainment and meritocracy is certainly out there. We got some fights coming up. Andrea Lee has been on a good streak. She's fighting Jojo Calderwood in a few weeks in Abu Dhabi. I mean, there are some matchups. It's a pretty interesting division. It's kind of a green division, so there's really no precedent set on how this thing should go, who should get the next shot, so forth and so on. How do you think this should work out? Where is this going to go for Valentina following her win on Saturday?
I like all the previous points because they tie into kind of a meritocracy, and I'm more of a meritocracy guy. Unfortunately, you mentioned Chookagian, who I agree. That's probably the more than likely the next bet. And unfortunately, it'll probably be a similar fight because you've got even more of a stronger counter presence, even more kind of air punching, if you will. So it's going to produce a kind of a similar fight that we just saw. And unfortunately, since the UFC is such a crazy schedule, that'll be again thrown and buried on some ESPN Plus cards. So although I do agree with people said prior, I'll just add a couple new things that are outside of the matchups that I think still answer your question as far as what to do with Shevchenko next. Now, I've never been a Tough fan, guys. Probably the last Tough I watched full was Tough 10, the heavyweight season, or whatever the hell that Mitrio and Kimbo one was, right? Not a Tough fan, but if they still had Tough, this would be a perfect time where, like, let's keep Valentina busy. She can speak the language well enough. Let's get her some exposure. I know it's not an end-all, be-all, a life changer, but you do that. We don't have Tough anymore, but we do have things like Daniel Cormier doing that ESPN breakdown thing that I think Kobe Bryant would do for the NBA. Let's do one on Valentina Shevchenko. Even though I agree, let's not do the Nunes fight. That doesn't mean we can't plant more seeds there. Let's break down that Nunes fight and have Cormier do a take on it. And when we do book Chookagian, maybe we don't do it at ESPN Plus card. Book her on the same time Nunes fights.
Very good use of going last, Dan, because, I mean, there really wasn't a big way you could go with this. There wasn't a lot of different variation. I mean, you could try to think outside the box, and you did there, and that's why you pick up the 10 points, 9 for everybody else. Continuing on with UFC Uruguay, if you are a professional wrestling fan, and this made me think of this the other night, but if you remember that WrestleMania in Toronto, Hulk Hogan wrestles The Rock, and the whole building went absolutely bananas. It was a sight to be seen, and everybody was talking about this incredible moment where Hulkamania was running wild up north in Toronto. And then the match ends, and poor Chris Jericho and Triple H had to follow all of that craziness, and nobody remembers how that thing went down. Nobody cared. It was just impossible to match the action and everything that happened, you know, in that match between Rock and Hogan. We saw sort of the same thing on Saturday. It would have been really difficult for Shevchenko and Carmouche to even come close to that barn burner that Mike Perry and Vicente Luque gifted us on Saturday. That fight was like buying a Toyota in the late 1980s. It was like everything you dreamed of and more. Perry with the nastiest nose break I've ever seen. These two guys just stood in the pocket. They had a slugfest, and Vicente Luque squeaks out a unanimous a split decision win and a fight of the night to boot. Luque quietly is just on this really strong winning streak right now. So I guess the question is, and we're going to start with Davidson Baker here, whose stock rose more on Saturday in the overall scheme of things? Vicente Luque with a victory or Mike Perry with a loss?
To be honest with you, I think the fight was close enough to where it just comes down to the fact that who was the person in the proverbial A situation that got their hand raised. Obviously, their stock rises. And B, the person that doesn't, obviously, their stock lowers. It's really as simple as that when you have a fight that I believed was as close as this fight was. I originally scored it for Mike Perry. I went back and watched it again, and I changed my mind. I thought that Vicente Luque probably won 2 of the 3 rounds. It was a close fight, though, and there's nothing to lose in terms of stock when you are the one, or at least coming into the week before with a number next to his name, and for some reason the Christmas ghost of the UFC rankings pass, I know I botched that, took him out of it in favor of Jeff Hands of Steel Neal at number 15. Vicente Luque is a guy that has something to prove. He every single fight that he has won in the UFC until last night was won by way of finish. I think that his stock could not have fallen any lower than it, unless he would have taken the L last night, or on Saturday night rather. Mike Perry, he's going to be out for a while. I think that obviously with his injuries and the absolutely awful nose break, it's hard to say that Mike Perry's stock can be up with a loss and a broken nose in the rearview of things.
Craig, what do you think? Whose stock rose, amongst the fans, amongst websites, amongst what MMA media is talking about, and just overall with their performances on Saturday? Vicente Luque with the win or Mike Perry with the loss?
I'm glad that you picked me to go next, because realistically, in Davidson Baker's answer, it was kind of reminiscent of Melvin Gillard's combat sports career. it was kind of all right for a little bit. He took a ton of L's, and now he's getting knocked out in bare knuckle championship where nobody's watching. And not to say that nobody's watching this, but Davidson, man, ease off the brakes. Like, let's take it for what it's worth. So we look at Luque, we look at Perry. Realistically, both guys are both $50,000 richer. The only difference between it is one guy's going to take a couple of weeks off, go on a nice vacation, get back into the gym, and he's gunning for the top of the division. The other guy's taking kind of prize fights, and oh, by the way, he's out for 6+ months, and you have to really worry about the disfigurement in that nose. I mean, is he going to have trouble breathing in future? Is this going to hinder his performances? More than likely not. I mean, he's got a chin of granite, but realistically, Luque's the one that really rose more to the occasion, so to speak. He's a guy that he fights fire with fire. We saw Perry in this fight land nice uppercuts through the guard. We saw him land nice left hooks as well. But as far as the fight goes, Luque's one of those guys that I'd like to see fight a top talent. He was already booked to face Neil Magny before the USADA issues. Maybe the winner of Li Jing Liang and Elezu Zaleski dos Santos, maybe that's what's next. Man, the sky's the limit for this guy right now.
Dan, Tom, what are your thoughts on this?
I got to shoot you guys straight here. I mean, as far as scorecards, both, because I tweeted them, and also my opinion. I'm one of the few that actually lean toward a 30-27 Luque, which sounds crazy. But at the same time, I don't think a 29-28 Perry scorecard was crazy. And while I was tweeting my scores, I was also tweeting that I was clearly more impressed with actually Mike Perry. You know, he's able to fight composed, make real in-fight adjustments, regardless of how you scored the fight. So I came away more impressed with Perry. And I think from a stock perspective, it's ironic because Luque admitted, he's like, I only took this fight to bring my stock up because he deserves a top-ranked guy. He deserves a ranking next to his name. But in answer to this question, I think Perry ultimately still gets the rub more. He obviously already had it prior. He was already tracking, even with his kind of win-loss record, his inconsistencies. But now he's shown to actually fight smart, hard. And you got it, of course, the viral thing. Whether you're on the receiving end or, you know, in this case, if it's a broken nose as opposed to a knockout, not as bad, you're still going viral. I think he gets multiple rubs from that and what he did from the technical perspective.
Wow, didn't even need to give him the 10-second warning. That's how it's done, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking of probably having to give the 10-second warning multiple times, Keith, what is your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll take his additional 10 seconds. Listen, I don't know what the heck. This question is crazy. I mean, we got guys talking about Hulk Hogan, Charles Dickens, and all kinds of stuff. Listen, I actually agree with Tom. I scored a 30-27 for Vicente Luque too. Listen, Mike Perry, like, what's this nonsense? Mike Perry's stock going up? Dude, his nose was one of the worst disfigurement I've ever seen. I mean, his nose was as crooked as the Clinton administration. I mean, he's out for, Craig said 6 months. That's 6 months until he can have contact. You figure when he starts doing sparring and training camp, you're talking about 9 months, possibly a year. You don't miss action for a year and have your stock go up. I mean, that's crazy. As Craig said, it might affect his breathing in the future. It might make him gun shy. I mean, who knows? Listen, Mike Perry's fun, but he has won 3 out of his last 7 fights. You compare that to Vicente Luque, who's won 10 out of 11. He's won 7 in a row. And the post-fight show, they're already talking about his next matchup. And they're not saying, hey, do you want to fight Jeff Neal? Or do you want? They're talking about top 10 guys. Former welterweight title contender Stephen Thompson. They asked him about a main event fight against Santiago Ponzinibbio. These are the matches he's getting. Mike Perry's going to be stuck in a hospital. Listen, what I'm really worried about Mike Perry is, when your nose gets messed up like that, I wonder if it's going to affect the snorting of coke that he does. And is he going to have to change to heroin?
Second.
Homeless and dead? I mean, this is really bad for Mike Perry.
You know, Keith, I have to disagree with you slightly because you said a guy that's been out for that long, how can his stock rise? Nate Diaz is fighting on Saturday, and his stock continues to rise, even though he hasn't done anything in the last almost 3 years. But to kind of throw it back, we're going to throw it back to you, Keith. I'm going to give you some more time to talk here because you mentioned it. Luque had called for a fight with Stephen Thompson after the victory. Do you like that fight, or do you think he gets matched up with a guy like a Jeff Neal who's on the rise as well?
Well, I've said this, and John, who's producing the show in the background that a lot of people don't know he's here, he's probably sick of me saying this. I honestly believe the welterweight division is as stacked of a division as any division has ever been. I mean, I think it actually goes all the way back to about 2003, 2004, when you had the loaded UFC 205 and the loaded Pride 205 and all those guys. I think the welterweight division is that stacked that pretty much you can just throw names in a hat, pull 2 guys out, and I'm exact. I mean, we talk about top 15. We got guys like Vicente Luque, who's not even ranked in the top 50 in the UFC. And that's not even going worldwide, bringing in Bellator or something. So, yeah, man, I would love to see Stephen Thompson versus Vicente Luque. I mean, you got two guys known for their striking going at it. You got Santiago Ponzinibbio, two savages in Santiago Ponzinibbio and Vicente Luque throwing bombs. Hell, you said, I mean, if Jeff Neal versus Vicente Luque is a consolation prize, dude, sign me up. I mean, that's another violent nonsense. I mean, listen, welterweight is as good a division as it's ever been, and I can't. And then you just added Gilbert Burns to the division, who looks great. I mean, I just love welterweight division. I think everyone should just go. Guys should cut down from weight. Guys should move up. We should just put everybody at welterweight. I mean, it's fantastic.
Dan, Tom, who's the fight to make, you think, for Vicente Luque next?
I want to just add on to the Stephen Thompson quote, talk, and as well, I don't know if it was Davison earlier saying, that Luque, stock went down from his performance. Even if he didn't score it from him, I think it's unfair to say his stock went down. And the reason why that ties into the Stephen Thompson matchup and why I actually would like that is because Luque fought Perry, even though Perry's a complete different fighter than Stephen Thompson. He fought him like Anthony Pettis did. He was using the shell guard, low kicks, measured right hand counters. And sure, there were certain straight shots and body shots and things up the middle, like uppercuts that got through like they did on Pettis with Thompson. And I think that just makes for a fun style matchup. And Luque just needs that name because I didn't mention this earlier, but he's stuck in Ponzinibbio and Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos territory, the quiet winning streaks in South America right now in that stacked welterweight division that Keith was talking about. And he needs all those guys need to get out of that pool. And I think that's Luque's way to get out is through Stephen Thompson.
Craig, I would throw it to you, but we got your take on what could be next for him. Davidson, what do you think should be next?
It's hard to disagree with that range of the Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos. I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking a crack at the famous led Caposa branded violence weight championship of the world that Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos and Li Jingliang are fighting for. Obviously, hardcores will love every second of that. And unfortunately, given the fact that fighters have the power to say yes or no to any fight that is thrown their way, who knows when Vicente Luque is going to get a top 10 guy if he hasn't got one at this point. My guess would be in that Zaleski dos Santos range. Maybe once Neil Magny gets out of the principal's office, they can fire him his way. Somewhere in that realm is probably realistic. I like the Ponzinibbio fight, though, if I lived in a perfect world.
I like that as well. We got 19 apiece for Craig and Dan. Keith and Craig with 18 points apiece. No, Davidson and Keith with 18 points apiece. But, we transition to UFC 241 is coming up on Saturday night. Like I said before, it is a loaded card, but it will be headlined by a rematch for the UFC heavyweight title between Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic. We haven't seen Stipe since he lost the title to DC last summer, and we haven't seen DC since he beat Derek Lewis and, was suffering from some lingering injuries that he had to get healed up. And, there's more than just the UFC heavyweight title on the line when it comes to these two, if you ask people in the MMA community. So going on the other side of the fourth wall, you guys have had time to think about this question because there's many ways you could probably go with this. What else is at stake on Saturday night between DC and Stipe? And you're all going to have a chance to answer, but each of you can only choose one fighter to respond to this question with. So it's either going to be, what's on the line for Stipe or what's on the line for DC, and you can present your argument as such. So Craig Allen, we're going to start with you, sir.
So I'm not going to go with DC because his legacy and everything that he goes for is already set in stone. I mean, look at Roger Huerta being featured on Sports Illustrated really early on in his career. Kind of derailed everything. Look at Conor McGregor. He was on there. Yeah, it was great, and it boosted his stock and whatnot. But who was really reading Sports Illustrated for MMA at that point in time? So you got to look at it on the other side. DC's already got, speaking gigs and whatnot. For Stipe Miocic, he sounds like if I took a couple of pieces of paper and maybe a piece of corrugated cardboard and put it over there in my paper shredder. That's what he sounds like. He's very tough to market. Yes, he has a big Modelo sponsorship, but other than that, he's been away from the sport for so long. For Stipe Miocic to cement himself in that greatest of all time legacy type of conversation, you have to really, really put on a great performance, something that fans are going to remember. Because for Cormier, he can rest on his laurels. Yes, he's already one of the greatest of all time. He's won 2 different belts. He's made successful title defenses. For Stipe, it's only one thing. He's got that heavyweight record, yes, but man, he's got to put on a statement performance here, win his belt back, and then build back up to where he was before the Cormier fight, the first one.
Dan, Tom, in a sport where recency bias sometimes trumps everything, what is at stake for Stipe Miocic or actually Daniel Cormier?
I think I'm going to kind of take a turn involving both of them, but I think what's at stake here is John Jones going to heavyweight, is my angle here. It's something that I and many have wanted for some time. People were talking about John going to heavyweight to fight DC's teammate, Cain Velasquez, when he was reigning the division. Of course, there were the rumors of Stipe, but if Cormier wins, which tip of the hand, I'm predicting for him to do it again. If he wins, I think that kills John Jones's chance of coming to heavyweight, because I do not believe from either side any of this talk and continuing talk between Jones and DC that they want this fight. I think both guys, in their weird ways, are at peace with the history, but at the same time, still pissed off about it in their own way. And I think they're accepting that DC staying at heavyweight and John Jones ain't coming up. And if DC singing a similar tune, I'm not buying it, guys. So I think that if Stipe wins, we actually get a better chance of seeing Jones make that heavyweight jump. I think if we put this on a poll, people would rather see that. That's the angle for me, kind of the low-key angle of what I'm looking at.
Interesting. Keith, what do you think?
Well, I think the obvious is the title of best UFC heavyweight of all time. I mean, Stipe is kind of the consensus right now because of his 3 title defenses. But if he loses to DC again, and DC has 2 wins on him, and now DC has 1 less title defense, but 2 head-to-head wins, it's DC probably steals that title for him. So that's why I think it's more important Stipe. But also, if Stipe beats DC, I think he's in the conversation. Forget UFC. I think he's in the conversation and maybe even surpasses Fedor as the greatest heavyweight of all time. Now, a lot of people are going to say, oh, my God, Fedor was undefeated for 10 years. But who did Fedor fight? Let's go through the actual heavyweights that Fedor fought. He fought Mirko Cro Cop. He fought Antonio Nogueira. He fought Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovski in the midst of long losing streaks. He fought Heath Herring, like a B-level heavyweight. Now compare that to Stipe Miocic. Stipe Miocic would have wins over Francis Ngannou, Junior Dos Santos, Alistair Overeem, Fabricio Verdum, Andrei Arlovski, Mark Hunt, Roy Nelson, and then you want to add Daniel Cormier or win over Daniel Cormier on that list? Listen, like Craig said, DC is already cemented. I mean, if DC wins, he probably moves up, in my opinion, probably to the same tier as George St. Pierre, 1 tier below John Jones. But if
10 seconds.
Stipe wins, he puts himself in the top 10 conversation all time. But if he loses to DC again, he kind of falls back in that range with Randy Couture and Cain Velasquez and Fabricio, as in very good, but not all-time great heavyweights. But I want to correct one thing real quick. Craig Allen said no one reads Sports Illustrated. Mike Hack used to write for Sports Illustrated, and I used to read every single week when Mike Hack had something for Sports Illustrated.
You're buttering the wrong piece of bread, Keith. Davidson, it's on you, sir.
So I'm going to take the Stipe angle here, and I'm going to say so by agreeing a lot with what Craig said about DC's legacy, and even more so with what Dan said too, the resting place that John and DC's kind of beef and history can kind of lay if we don't get that third fight again, and that the two do seem like they are kind of at peace, somewhat with that while being a little bit pissed off. Anyway, I think the angle on Stipe is great here because obviously going into his first fight as a pretty hefty size favorite, obviously the heavyweight champion, 82%, somewhere around 82%, while looking at the numbers of fighters going into title fight rematches, retain their belt. About 70% of them go by finish. It's pretty difficult for the fighter in the rematch that lost the first time to come back and win it the second time. And how about this rarefied air that Stipe Miocic can put himself in being a fighter to win a title fight rematch after losing the first time. And the other 3 were only Randy Couture when he fought Vitor Belfort, and Vitor Belfort won by glove eye cut, that freak accident. Robbie Lawler in his rematch with Johnny Hendricks. And the other one is slipping me. I should have
10 seconds.
It all down. But regardless,
the other one, I'm going to help him out. I'm going to steal his points. The other one was Chuck Liddell beating Randy Couture, you idiot. Give me my points.
Davidson listening to too much DMX. Man, you're slipping, you're falling, you can't get up.
Yeah, man. I rest my case there. I'm not on it.
No further questions, Your Honor. Good Lord. I want to bring back the John Jones factor. I know Dan brought it up, and I know we've kind of talked about it a little bit more, but, when John Jones tweets about something during fight week, it's usually something that, the end result is the exact opposite of what he says. I mean, this is a guy who said, yeah, I'm going to fight Stipe. There's no chance of that happening. This is a guy who said, a number of different things, and the exact opposite happens every single time. So the tweets he sent out today, for those who didn't see it, is he basically said, like, I'm not going to heavyweight. I have no interest in going to heavyweight. I never had any interest in going to heavyweight. And if Daniel Cormier, wants to fight me a third time, it's going to be at 205. And there's no chance in hell he's going to go back down to 205 and put his body through that. So with that being said, Jon Jones is a guy that has a lot of work to do when it comes to making things up to the fans. He always seems to find himself in trouble. And just as things are starting to turn the corner for him, something else comes up. Whether Dana White saw video of certain footage and, the narrative is out there about Jon Jones, he needs to do all these different things to sort of appeal himself to the fan base once again. So I think moving to heavyweight and fighting DC or even fighting Stipe would be a good way to do that for the chance to make some history. So Craig or Davis, I'm going to go back to you here. Do you think that the winner of this fight is going to fight Jon Jones? And what are the chances of that happening?
I think there's honestly a greater chance that if Daniel Cormier wins this fight, that he goes on to fight Jon Jones. I think obviously the Stipe fight is possible and plausible as well. But, Dana's mentioned it a bunch of times. We've said many times on this show in the past, you can't ever take for a grain of salt Dana saying something to believe it to be true right away. But I think both guys do deep down want it. I actually am in the minority by thinking, I think if they do fight again, it's going to be at 205. I don't know if it's going to be at heavyweight. That's actually my prediction, and I am in the vast minority of saying that. But I will go ahead and lay that to rest. If I do see them fighting again, I think it's at 205.
I would like to see them in heavyweight, but that's just me. Keith, what do you think? Do you think the winner gets Jon Jones here? Do you think that fight happens? Do you think that what's the percentage you put on that anyways?
I put about 50-50. I mean, Jon Jones is the boss. Jon Jones does what he wants to do. But my question is, why would he go up to heavyweight to fight DC? It makes no sense. Why give DC? You're already up 2-0. You knocked him out. I mean, sure, people say, oh, the PEDs and he doesn't have that win. Listen, millions and millions of people saw you knock out your rival. I mean, he's up 2-0. Why would you give him the satisfaction? Why would you look, especially if that's going to be DC's retirement fight? Imagine DC beats Jon Jones. He finally beats Jon Jones. He beats Jon Jones. Now it's 1-1 with one no contest. And DC's got 2 championships in this. He might actually steal the title from Jon Jones, his greatest ever. What is the reward for Jon Jones beating up DC a third time? I actually agree with Davidson. I actually think if Stipe wins, there's a better chance that Jon Jones is going to be, because it's a challenge he hasn't overcome yet. He's already overcome the DC thing. So these guys like to challenge themselves. That's where I think Stipe would be, most people saying the greatest heavyweight of all time. He just beat DC. He's also now the second person to beat DC. So that kind of raises his stock. So now Jon Jones is not the only person to ever beat DC. So I really think if you ask me if Stipe wins, I put it more like 55%. But if DC wins, 45%.
All right, Craig, what's your percentage on the winner of this fight fighting Jon Jones?
I mean, you got to go 50-50. I'll throw a little bit of a curveball, but it's not much of one out there. My other 50%, Francis Ngannou. I mean, it seems like he's the most likely contender at heavyweight. Again, do you really want to see him take on DC? I mean, we saw what a really good wrestler in Stipe Miocic did against Ngannou. And of course, listen, he's gained leaps and bounds since then. Of course, going back to the MMA factory, training at home in France with a guy like Cyril Gane that we saw this weekend. But, I mean, if you have a look at DC versus Jon Jones, who wants to see that again? I mean, really, do you really, really want to see that? I mean, if you wanted to see that, then you probably wanted to see Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell #3. You probably want to see Rampage Jackson and Vanderlei Silva and Bellator when they were deep into their 40s. So, yeah, I mean, I personally want to see Ngannou versus DC, but if DC decides that he wants to ride off into the sunset on a win, I mean, who can blame him? Like we said early on in the question, he's already got media gigs, sponsorship deals, what have you. And his last tweet, he came out and said, of course, Jon Jones wants to fight me. He's fought 3 times this year, and I'm going to make more this weekend than he will if he fights again this year. And, of course, Jones has fought 3 times already. So, yeah, I just don't want to see that fight.
All right. We have 28 points apiece for Keith, Craig, and Dan. Davidson with 27, probably like 27.5. It's that close right now. Big question here. As this is the last question before you say goodbye to one of our competitors tonight. We can't talk UFC 241. We've already discussed this a little bit. We mentioned him in passing. The return of Nate Diaz is coming up on Saturday. It's been nearly 3 years since we've seen him, and now he's back. He's scheduled to face Anthony Pettis on Saturday night in the co-main event. Now, Nate has always made his presence felt. He is once again done that in the build up to this fight with doing interviews with Ariel a couple months ago. He did another one with Brett Okamoto that got released this morning. You know, the UFC doesn't promote me. They held me back. I'm the lightweight champion, and a whole bunch of other narratives. Connor's had everything gifted and handed to him. You know, much like his brother, Nate is a draw. People love him, but this is a much different time in the sport than when Nick was going through this. And even when Nate was fighting back in 2016, when he was fighting Conor McGregor, we're in a different place than we were before. The lightweight and welterweight divisions are both super deep, super loaded, like Keith was talking about. And Nate Diaz has been gone for a while. And while people are very excited about Nate Diaz coming back on Saturday, here's my question to you, Dan Tom. We'll start with you. And you can ask any fighter. Most will say that every fight is one already, but in all senses of the term, is this fight for Nate Diaz a must-win on Saturday, and why?
No, it's not a must-win. As great as Nate Diaz is moving the needle and you know, kind of making his announcements and presence known, like you said. You know, let's be honest. His record is 19-11, and I'm the first guy to defend the Randy Couture, BJ Penn-like records of the world. Maybe not BJ Penn anymore, obviously, but you get what I'm saying. MMA is a different sport than boxing. But a tweet that I tweeted out earlier today. I mean, let's not forget Nate Diaz by the odds, guys. If whether he's, you know, as talented as the hype deserves, and I'm a big Nate Diaz fan, so I don't want to come off as hating him. Whether the hype is as deserved as it is, or the public really is behind him, then why has Nate Diaz only been technically favored to win 2 of his last 12 fights, guys? And one of those was his TKO loss to Josh Thompson. The other was Gomi. He's been favored to lose every other fight. Now, he's proven the odds makers wrong on at least half those times, but the point is, it's not like there's some high ceiling that's expected. And you could argue the UFC maybe did try to give him some spots. And at the end of the day, it's not a must-win because ultimately he has this thing in Monopoly, guys. They call it get-out-of-jail-free card. And it's unfinished business with Conor McGregor. And I'm actually predicting, the breakdown's not out, but just I'll tip you guys off. I'm actually predicting Anthony Pettis to win. I think it's a terrible matchup for him. So Nate Diaz will probably be coming off a loss. Connor's already coming off of a loss. So I don't think it hurts his chances for his said get-out-of-jail-free card. So yes, in answer to your question, is it a must-win? Absolutely not.
Interesting. Nate's talked about a lot. He wants to be a champion at some point. He wants the big money fights, and obviously the Conor fight's there. I feel like day by day, week by week, month by month, you know, that fight has lost some sizzle, but when you put those two guys together, those combustible elements, so to speak, you know, that could obviously be brought back up. But Keith, I'm going to ask you the same question. I mean, there's a lot on the line here. He said a lot of different things. This is a big spot for him after taking so much time off. Is this a must win for the career of Nate Diaz?
No, I agree with Dan. It's not a must-win. I mean, you just mentioned about Mike Perry. If Mike Perry can get his nose smoked, I don't think Nate Diaz losing to Anthony Pettis is that big of a deal. Listen, casual fans love Nate. He's one of the most popular fighters in the UFC. I mean, just think about this. There's a media day this week on Thursday, but Nate Diaz gets a one-on-one with Brett Okamoto for an hour before that. He doesn't have to do the media day. When he got the Conor fight, he was 2-3 out of his last 5. He was coming off a win over 19-14 Michael Johnson. That's when he got the biggest fight of his career against Conor McGregor. Many people, especially casual fans, believe that he should be up 2-0 over the biggest star in the sport. It's people have been calling for unlike the Amanda Nunes, Shevchenko fight or the DC Jones. It actually is 1-1, and it makes sense to match it. Listen, he's a big draw. If you had your casual friends to name, 5 or 6 fighters, chances are they got to say Nate Diaz. Listen, the Diaz brothers have this like shine around them that fans just love. For example, look at his brother. His brother hasn't had a win in 8 years, and it wasn't that long ago when people were connecting him to it was rumored to fight Tyron Woodley for the welterweight title when he hadn't won a win in 8 years. Listen, you want to go back 8 years and show how bad guys are? 8 years ago, the MVP voting in the American League, the top vote getters were Jacoby Ellsbury, Curtis Granderson, Adrian Gonzalez, Michael Young, and Paul Konerko. Listen,
10 seconds.
His record doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. As long as he plays that Cholo gangster thing, people are still going to want to watch him fight. Plus, win or lose, he's probably having an entertaining fight. And even if he gets smoked by Anthony Pettis, he's still going to say that he won.
That's a good point right there. Craig, what do you think, man? Is this a must-win in your opinion for Nate Diaz, or do you think he's just going to cruise along to the Conor trilogy fight and all is well?
I mean, is this when I make a heel turn and disagree with everybody? Because so far we've all agreed on every single answer. So let's look at it this way. And I love going by the numbers. The number 1 all-time grossing pay-per-view, Conor McGregor, Khabib Nurmagomedov. Number 2, number 3, you've got UFC 196 and 202. Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz. So yeah, like Dan said, there's a get out of jail free card in Nate Diaz's favor. And realistically, he can do no wrong. These are guys that can go out and party and say whatever they want, and nobody seems to really care. And yeah, the inactivity has to play in it a little bit. But are people more excited for this fight than they were for a main event on a fight night card? Yeah, of course they are. We just keep getting these loaded co-main events. And Dan makes a really good point. Anthony Pettis looks THICC ahead of this fight. He is a thick boy. And at 170, I think he just adds that much more power. His striking looks great. Of course, he's been training nonstop. And yeah, people thought he lost a little bit of his luster recently at 155, just like they thought about Aldo at one point. But Anthony Pettis just keeps gaining. So yeah, I see, of course, Anthony Pettis getting a win here. But a loss for Nate Diaz, does it really mean a whole lot? No. I mean, you can still play up the Conor McGregor card. You can still play up big money fights. He's still a huge draw in the sport. The casual fans are still going to love him. And I just don't see a loss here going the way of Diaz affecting him all that much.
Well, we know what the other 3 competitors think, Mr. Davidson Baker. What do you think? Like, let me kind of paraphrase this. What if Anthony Pettis goes out there and just smokes Nate Diaz on Saturday? Like, one-sided drubbing for like 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Anthony Pettis just puts it on Nate and finishes him. Then what happens?
Anthony Pettis smokes Nate Diaz into Nate Diaz smoking a ton of CBD in front of press at press conferences. That's exactly what happens, because I don't even know how much Nate Diaz cares about getting his hand raised in this fight. I actually think the promotional package the UFC put together was pretty on point in terms of the overall narrative of where these two have history. This fight kind of came out of nowhere. I don't think a lot of people expected this to be the co-main event of a mid-August pay-per-view about 2 or 3 months ago. But also about 7 or 8 months ago, Anthony Pettis and Nate Diaz, both coming into 2019, both didn't have a whole lot to lose. Anthony Pettis in his only fight this year didn't have a whole lot to lose. And he went in there and did what he did against Wonderboy Thompson. Here's the problem, though, with Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz, having received the big money fight, the red panty night, all of the things that come along with the Conor McGregor fights, give you that type of security in terms of financial structure that, do I really need to take this fight? Do I really need to fight this guy? Not even to mention Nate Diaz 2-3 at welterweight, and his only win other than Conor McGregor being over Marcus Davis. He called himself the king of the lightweight division. He said he won the Conor McGregor rematch. And like Keith said, if he beats Pettis or doesn't beat Pettis, I think he would probably tell the media he thought he did anyway.
Okay. We've all been getting along so swimmingly for the most part tonight. For the first time tonight, we have not one, but we have 2 rebuttals coming up here. Keith was first. Go ahead.
Well, listen, it's like a perfect scenario. Just having Nate Diaz fight again is just the perfect scenario for the UFC. Could you get another draw back? I mean, look at it. When Ronda Rousey lost to Holly Holm, she was still a huge draw. Her pay-per-view against Amanda Nunes was still a huge, big thing. I mean, look at this. Brock Lesnar was coming back, and people wanted him to fight DC for the title. And, I mean, Brock Lesnar beat, one fight in like 10 years, and that was a controversial steroid use against Mark Hunt. Listen, no one cares. But the best thing is the division he's coming back. He's not fighting at lightweight. He's fighting at welterweight. It is so loaded. Now, listen, imagine if Nate wins. Nate wins, you can make Conor win or lose, but maybe you book him against Tyron Woodley. Woodley and the Diaz brothers had smoke together. Hey, Masvidal saying, hey, I only want to wait for the title of Conor. Hey, Nate wins. I'm sure that's a fight that Masvidal suddenly would be interested in because Nate's a big money fight. Hey, Nate always like, hey, I'll fight anybody. Hey, no one wants to fight Leon Edwards. Maybe Nate steps up. But hey, say Nate loses. Hey, you can still imagine Nate and Ben Askren going at it at a press conference. When those 2 guys get it. Or even like Nate versus Kevin Lee, another guy who's up in the welterweight now, and them 2 guys going at it. But say he gets smoked. Say I think not only just beats him, but absolutely smokes him, knocks him out 1 minute, and Nate doesn't have it anymore. Oh, there's still matches you can match him up. Imagine putting him against Carlos Condit, revenging, his brother's loss. His brother was going for the title. He lost to Condit. Now it's Nate's chance to beat him. Or how about this? How about Nate versus Mike Perry? I mean, imagine those 2 guys with the Cholo Gangster and the Florida white trash thing going on. I mean, listen, it's endless opportunities for Nate. I mean, it's Nate coming back is good business for UFC.
I don't disagree with that. Craig also would like to rebuttal. Go ahead.
All right, Davidson, here goes, buddy. So first of all, apparently Conor McGregor's been spending a lot of time with Artem Lobov because he was spending the red panty night in like a Russian hotel there? Come on, buddy. So there's your first strike. Second strike, you talked about Nate Diaz's fight with Marcus Davis. That was the first fight on the main card of one UFC pay-per-view with Frankie Edgar and BJ Penn in the main event, and Nate Diaz made it the fight of the night. He beat the absolute piss out of Marcus Davis, who, listen, you got to side with him. I mean, Maine zone. He's from Holton, Maine, which is a stone's throw away from New Brunswick. He's got a great gym over there. But Nate Diaz really put himself on the map and made himself a superstar with that fight, among other fights that he's had. That was a huge one. That card also had Randy Couture versus 0-1 MMA superstar James Toney. So, Davidson, if you're going to pull fights out of your rear end, pick a better Nate Diaz fight, man.
Davidson, would you like to respond?
There's just no correlation there because you can't pick another Nate Diaz win at welterweight because they don't exist. At least Conor McGregor's not a true welterweight. I don't count that as a welterweight win. Do you count that? I don't think that should be counted as a welterweight win.
It was at 170 pounds. What are you going to count it as?
I guess the technicality of it being that they weighed in at 170 pounds, it's a welterweight win, but Conor McGregor's not a welterweight.
Hey, technically, Roy Markham, that win, I think he fought like at 184. It was a catchweight. So Diaz's other welterweight win is technically, you could poke holes into that being a welterweight win as well.
But he says that Conor wasn't a true welterweight, that he's a lightweight. Wasn't Marcus Davis at one point fighting that lightweight too?
Yes, he was.
So does that even count as a welterweight fight? Because Marcus Davis one-time fought. But hey, Nate Diaz one-time fought. I mean, BJ Penn once fought at heavyweight. Does that make him a heavyweight, or does that what are we gonna start figuring out? Oh, that doesn't count because this person. Listen, if you start taking people out of their weight classes, Fedor has 2 wins at heavyweight. I mean, Mark Coleman once fought at 205. Did we not count that as a heavyweight win for Fedor?
Good point.
Someone had to say something. I was like, who's going to say something here? All right. We're going to move on to the next question. And unfortunately, it was just the timing just wasn't right. Maybe it was the order or whatnot. But Davidson, we have to say goodbye to you, my friend. Any parting words for the folks?
Good night.
Good night. We love you.
That's all I say every time. Thanks for having me on, guys. I'll see you guys next week.
Buddy. My dog said bye, Davidson. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Dan.
Check out Davidson's work. He does a great job with MyMMAnews.com, Cage Side Press, Fansided MMA, and many more. The guy's all over the place. He was on with Craig Allen, a rising star in the sport and a rising star in this program. And we hate to see him go, but we have to move on. We can't have a 4-way this time. Davidson just couldn't get it done. The Rebels just beat him to the punch at this point in more ways than one. But we're down to 3 competitors. We have Craig, we have Dan, we have Keith, and we're going to stick on UFC 241 for a minute. Just briefly, because actually, you know what, we're gonna do that a little bit later. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Saturday, but there's a lot of fights in the card we can dissect. But another piece of big news last week, that's what we're going to talk about. ESPN's Brett Okamoto reported that after speaking with his manager Ali Abdulaziz and head coach Mark Henry, Frankie Edgar is going to be making the drop to 135 pounds, and the plan, at least the hope, is to have him make his bantamweight debut at UFC 244 in New York at Madison Square Garden, which is just a fitting place to make that happen. Now, bantamweight, we've been talking about loaded divisions. We talked about the welterweight division. We talked about the lightweight division. Bantamweight is another super exciting and compelling division in the UFC. And the pickings are definitely not slim for fun fights with Frankie Edgar. But realistically, let's just say, hypothetically, Frankie Edgar is already booked to fight at UFC 244. And your arguments, gentlemen, will determine who he's going to fight in November at MSG. And we're talking about guys who are ready, guys who aren't booked already, and can realistically make that date. Who should Frankie Edgar fight in his 135-pound debut? Let's just say it happens at UFC 244, Keith.
All right. Well, I mean, let's talk about he should have moved down to bantamweight a long time ago. But now that he's here, we should all be happy. Listen, when you fight for the title, you're going to fight a top 15 ranked guy next. So let's go to the bantamweight rankings and let's look at it. So Cejudo's out for a while, and when he comes back, he's going to defend the bantamweight belt. When he decides to defend it, it sounds like it's going to be Sterling. So those 2 guys are out. Marlon Moraes' teammate, he's out. Pedro Munoz, Cody Garbrandt, Jimmy Rivera, John Dotson, Thomas Oliveira, they've all lost recently, so they're all out. Cody Stamen, Rob Font, Song Yadong, they're not big enough names. They're all out. And then he's already beaten Uriah Faber. So that leaves me 3 options. Now I'm going to go with a top 3, and you'll understand when I get to number 1 why I have to give backup options. So the third fight would be Pettis. It make a lot of sense. You got a hot guy versus Frankie Edgar, pretty much undefeated Russian, because he avenged his 1 loss to Magomedov, which is a fantastic. Both fights are fantastic fights. So that would kind of get over the Russian if he does. Another one would be Rafael Sancho versus Corey Sagan. The winner of that match would make a lot of sense because, especially Sandhagen, he'd be just coming off a huge veteran. Could he get by Frankie Edgar and get a title fight? But the fight that I'm actually going to go with is Dominic Cruz. Imagine 2 legendary fighters going head-to-head. Legacy bout for both guys, both coming off title losses. And then you got 2 of the best guys when it comes to footwork in the history of MMA. I actually think the fight would actually look a lot like Dominic Cruz versus TJ Dillashaw, which I was there live. It was an absolutely fantastic stylistic fight. It gets like guy like Dan Tom, like a Woody, thinking about like the stylistic breakdown between Dominic Cruz and Frankie Edgar. Listen, that's the fight, but I gave those other 2 because you know Dominic Cruz will get hurt, so you go with Sandhagen or Jan as backup plans.
All right, Craig, what do you think? Let's just say it's happening. Frankie's fighting at UFC 244 in November. It's at MSG. This is definitely happening. Realistically, based on who's available, who's there, who's the fight against?
That son of a gun. I mean, really, I was going to go every different way, and then I was going to build up to Dominic Cruz. I mean, you look at it. So you could really try and have a feud against Team Alpha Male. You could go after Cody Garbrandt. You could go after Uriah Faber. Maybe try and pitch that fight. I don't think that one makes a lot of sense because a guy like Uriah Faber coming back into the UFC so late into his career after retirement, after he's a Hall of Famer, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You want to build him up, give him more favorable matchups. And I think in a fight like that, Edgar's probably going to get the win. So if you go to a guy like Dominic Cruz, he's in that same kind of category as a guy that we just talked about in our last question in Nate Diaz. And I mean, Nate Diaz can really do no wrong. He can get whatever fight you really need to book him in. He's got that special aura about him. Dominic Cruz does as well. And this is a guy that we haven't seen since Cody Garbrandt put on a masterclass. And since then, he hasn't been able to defend a left hand. But realistically, Dominic Cruz makes a ton of sense because like Keith said, stylistically, it's a fun fight. You're going to have great footwork in that one. You're going to have really good striking. And as long as Dominic Cruz's ankles and knees can hold up, it should be a decent fight. So for me, that's the fight to book. Realistically, I don't think Cruz has a legit shot at the belt were he to get a win over Frankie Edgar and fight Henry Cejudo. But I do think that Edgar has a decent shot to make it to the top.
All right, Dan, since the theme is agreement tonight, are you agreeing Dominic Cruz is the guy that realistically he's going to be ready to fight in November? He's the guy?
I hate you guys because not only is that my answer, but I agree with Keith. It should have happened way before. In fact, I was on an end-of-the-year show in 2015 with an outlet I used to work for, shouts to MMA Latest. And at the end, we all had to give bold predictions, guys. And my bold prediction for 2016 was that Frankie Edgar, I didn't think he was going to get another shot with Aldo for an interim title at UFC 200. So I wanted him to drop down to bantamweight and fight Dominic Cruz for the title. And yeah, Keith nailed it with my boner and even threw my middle name Woody in there. So thank you for that, sir. So I would be lying if I didn't say it makes sense for all those reasons. I will add on, though, and kind of to add on to the answer. As an alternative, I do like the Sandhagen and a Sunsao winner. I like a Sunsao as an opponent. I don't like Sandhagen for his opponent because I like Sandhagen a lot. He's really good, and I see him just kind of wiping the floor with Frankie, to be honest, although Zabit Magomedsharipov makes a good training partner for that. But I can't lie, guys. It's got to be with Dominic Cruz. And if, you said, will he be healthy in time? You can never guarantee that with Dominic Cruz, so it doesn't matter what I say. But if we are going to lean on an injury-prone fighter, we might as well pair it up with another fighter who's recovering from injury, who has already mentioned guys like Frankie Edgar, albeit in a 145 sense, and that is Henry Cejudo. Do your best to try to get those booked at the same time. Even if Cejudo's returns back down to flyweight to fight Formiga or something, it would just be right to have those guys fight on the same night. It builds up for that, that potential talk for challenging for Cejudo's belt. So I'm sorry, guys. I really wanted to come with something fresh, but this is one of those ones I've had a hard opinion on this, and I'd be disingenuous if I changed it.
Yeah, this is just, a tough weekend, with so much going on, so much happening on Saturday, just not favorable for a game like this, but we're all having fun anyways. And unfortunately, time has run out for our good friend, Craig Allen. It was a hell of a battle. I wish we could bring 3 to the finals, but Keith just started things off, and it really was just timing that he got to go first with that question that really set the table for everybody else. So any parting words, Craig, with your Miami Vice style Fight Night Picks t-shirt?
I mean, I had two words written down, 2 words only for the last question. All I had was Dominic Cruz. So it is a shame that Keith went first, but man, awesome show. Dan, thanks so much for coming on, and I can't wait to listen to the finals and see who wins.
All right.
Listen, Craig, you tried go in Miami Vice, but listen, you're more Colin Farrell than Don Johnson. Get the hell out of here.
I like the shirt actually, Craig. So shouts, man. Nice meeting you.
All right. Canada's own Craig Allen. Check out his show Fight Night Picks. Just follow him on Twitter at Craig Allen FNP. Get all that good stuff. Now, before we head to
this is the finals that everybody wanted. I mean, the best breakdown guy in the world versus Dan Tom. I mean, how great is this?
Perfect. Before we get to the finals, the highly anticipated final matchup that everyone's been clamoring for between Keith and Dan Tom, we have to take care of some business, as this is your weekly reminder, ladies and gentlemen, to subscribe to the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network to not only get this show immediately upon release and on time, but also the Not Safe for Work MMA podcast with Kyle and Fred. It's funny, there's foul language, and most importantly, it gets released on time. So check that show out. Also a show that will be surely released on time this week, The Breakdown Show with Max Friedman and Marcel Dorff. They'll be coming at you this week to preview UFC 241. And also, don't forget the soon-to-be name change Sunday morning Quarterman that will now be called the Whenever I Get Around to It Quarterman with Keith and John Franklin to recap the action from, at this point, well, way after everybody else in their respective podcasts have done so. It's still great stuff anyways, even though you've heard it all before. It's just 4 days later than everybody else's show. So subscribe to the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or whatever it is you find your favorite podcast. Now, before we head to the final question, we have Keith taking on Dan Tom. Keith, I need you to pick a number between 1 and 25.
25.
And Dan, a number between 1 and 25.
17.
17 was the number, ladies and gentlemen. I'll screenshot it if you need the proof as well. But Keith went with 25. I don't understand that. So he could have taken really anything from 2 to 24.
It's pretty simple. I don't care if I go first or second. I'm going to beat him anyways.
Oh, wow.
All right. Well, Dan, since you have the option here, do you want to go first or second?
I'll take the coin toss my way. I'll go first.
All right. Dan's going to go first. Davidson has elected to go last. Both times he made it to the finals with this rule and has lost both of them. So this favors Dan very well here. We're going back to UFC 241. We've discussed a couple of the big fights. There are a lot of other exciting fights. It's a loaded up card. And I will say this, and I cannot dive into this further because you're going to find out soon enough. There is a shakeup to this card coming, and that's all I'm going to say. But anyways, we've had some loaded up cards this year already. But my question is this the best card of 2019 thus far on paper, or has there been a better card? Like, I know hindsight is a fickle beast. Some of these cards have already come and gone. We've seen how they played out. But on paper, excitement, build-up, how everybody's reacting to it, heading into it, etc. Is this the biggest card of the year for the UFC, Dan?
Man, I'm answering this completely blind. I don't have anything in front of me, guys. It's been a very weak year. And I will say yes, even though I can't, and I don't think we have time for me to go and argue down into the nitty-gritty prelims. But let's be honest, guys. You don't even have to be – you can be a casual fan to know it's been a very weak year. But specifically, I've been really clamoring about card structure. I'm not trying to be, anti-UFC or anything like that, or just trying to be, or just, criticize them because they're the UFC. No, it's a genuine criticism. I really liked how we had card structures. We've kind of abandoned, from how we start our main cards to particularly where I'm going with this and tying this into your answer is the co-main event. The co-main event has been killed, guys, in 2019 outside of pay-per-views. And even some of those are kind of arguable. Like, we've had, Derek Brunson we're going to see in this main card. We've seen him in a co-main event with Elias Theodorou. I mean, and even without how that matchup turned out, even on paper, it's not like it was the most promising thing. It's a narrative that I'm not seeing enough people talk about, which has been the death of the co-main event. So card for card, if we want to lay it out, I'd be more than willing to lay my money down before the argument starts that this would be the best card if we're going from the prelims to the top. But because of the co-main event, what I keep harping on here, the co-main event is so strong. We just kind of argued as to why and all the stakes that are attached to it. This co-main event blows out, most co-main events, even in the UFC Golden Era. Even if we're doing UFC Golden Era and Brock Lesnar's at the top of this card, I still think people are looking more forward to Anthony Pettis and Nate Diaz as a co-main event. You cannot say that about cards this year. So for that reason, it is the best card on paper this year so far.
And that is the question for you, Keith, as well. Is UFC 241 the biggest card of the year on paper, or can you make the argument that there's one better than this one?
No, it's the best one. I just want to say, Dan's very good at doing breakdowns. What he's not is doing promotion. I mean, he just said it's the best card of the year. I don't think he even named one fighter. I mean, listen, dude, say who we got. We have Daniel Cormier, one of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport, going against Stipe Miocic, one of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport, with not only the heavyweight title on, but the title of greatest UFC champion, heavyweight champion, the title of greatest heavyweight fighter in history, going at it, rematch, a little bit of trash. It's different this time than last time. Last time they were friendly, they were on the Ultimate Fighter, laughing, joking. Now they're mad at each other. Stipe's insulted them. They're ready to go. Listen, you get the return of Diaz, the top 5 biggest star in the world, coming back, returning with his gangster, going against Anthony Pettis, the guy that when Nate Diaz was coming up was the flashy guy that kind of like the complete opposite of Nate. When Nate is that I just want to fight, and Pettis is flashy and this and that. And they've had this rivalry for 5 years, and Nate's been calling for this fight. You got Yoel Romero versus Paulo Costa, 2 genetic freaks, crazy athleticism, chiseled, big knockout power, both of these guys. You got some of the best prospects in all of MMA. I think Yusuf is the best prospect in MMA. You got Ian Heinisch, a great prospect. You got Devontae Smith, a great prospect. You got this unbelievable stylistic matchup between Mandy Bernas, this jiu-jitsu wizard, versus Casey Kenny, this fantastic wrestler who's coming off an upset off of Ray Borg. On short notice, you get 2 of the best bantamweights, where this winner is not that short from a title fight in Corey Sandhagen, who's the new kid on the block, the hot come that seems like everyone's hey, this guy's going to be a future contender, versus Rafael Sunshine, who is historically ruining guys like that, who's taking the shine off those guys with just being technical and doing his thing that he's done. He made a career out of. And then you even got if you want to go all the way down to prelims, you got Sabina Manzo, who came in with a lot of buzz, trying to rebound, kind of get her career back. And then even a guy who's not that good, but is going to be Brandon Davis is never in a boring fight. And you got Brandon Davis who's going to be throwing bombs. I mean, from top to bottom, this card is incredible. It's by far the best card of the year so far.
Okay, just to have some fun here. What, besides this card, what was the best card of the year, you think, on paper, heading into it? Prior to this one. Well, Keith, go back to you. Maybe unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was killing myself. I kind of I'm always forward focused. The best card of the year is probably on paper. It's got to be the John Jones, Thiago. I mean, you had John Jones versus Thiago Santos. You had Manny Nunes. You had the 2 GOATs fighting on the same card against Holly Holm going to pull the big upset. A guy who actually gave John Jones the biggest threat. You had Ben Askren and Jorge Masvidal, which obviously that fight. It didn't become a fight. It was a 5-second knockout. But between those 3 on the top, I don't have the rest of the card. I don't remember everything on that card. But those 3 on the top, I mean, that is good of a top billing as you can get. But what I would argue between why this card is so much better is even though Thiago Santos had a great fight and he almost pulled up the upset, he was the closest to ever beat. He's the first guy to win a scorecard on John Jones. He didn't have that greatness around him like Stipe Miocic and DC. You got 2 all-time greats. That's why this card is the best.
What do you think, Dan? Prior to this card, which one do you think was, the deeper card, the one that everybody was more excited about heading into it prior to the one coming up on Saturday?
I'll give 2 examples because we're talking about on paper, and again, I don't have it off the top of my head. So Keith, you did kill it there as far as labeling off the fighters, not just names, as far as prospects. But here's the 2 cards and 2 different examples as far as on paper. To the question here, which is one was a terrible card. Okay, on paper though, I will argue that the matchups. It looked like it was going to be one of those low-key action fights. Instead, UFC San Antonio goes and sets a decision record, right, guys? But if you go back and look at those matchups on paper, they weren't the highest level matchups, but there was a lot of action fight matchups topped at the top with a technical action fight, at least on paper, which was going to be RDA and Leon Edwards. Now, another fight that was good on paper and looks better in retrospect, but if you go back, and again, I don't have it, I'll be able to name some names off here for you on this one at least. But if you go back even before the fights were awesome, I believe it was UFC 235 in Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, Israel Adesanya, Kelvin Gastelum was already a great fight before it happened on paper, at least enough to get you excited for. And then, of course, we had, Poirier and Holloway before that. And then, of course, you got, again, welterweight. We talk about how stacked that division is. Keith was mentioned. I think we had I don't know if Jeff Neal was on that card, but I know Curtis Melender versus Bilal was on that card. I mean, we had a lot of kind of action style fights. I believe Nico Price might have been on that card. A lot of the Florida guys were booked from ATT and whatnot, and kind of moving up on that card. But yeah, I believe is UFC 235. I'll put my money on, because that was the one that was coming to my mind where I couldn't quite decide. But again, on paper, I will still stick to the this weekend UFC 241. But I want to give a shot to UFC 235.
Keith, what do you want to say now? I mean, you're already the biggest star of the show. You've already taken my role and everybody else's role. What else could you possibly have to say?
I gotta pick a fight with Dan. Dan just said he mentioned the Israel Adesanya, Kelvin Gastelum in the that was the same night as Poirier and Max Holloway. And while both those fights delivered, the question was, is this the best on paper? And if you look at that card, that was an extremely top-heavy fight. Those were the two top villains. You know what the third fight from the top was? It was Khalil Rountree versus Eric Anders. Well, obviously that was a one-sided fun, whooping. No one thought that was a main card pay-per-view type. The next one down was Dwight Grant and Alan Jouban. And before that was Nikita Krylov and Edovit Peru. I mean, I don't know what he calls deep. That to me, that's not deep. That is extremely shallow. No, it's top-heavy, but the rest of the way it's shallow.
Well, I guess I could agree with you, considering I still put UFC 241. But let's be honest, the example that you saw, you were real high on Derek Brunson and Ian Heinisch is no different than Dwight versus Jouban. We have a notable action fighter who, by the way, I would say that Jouban has more bonuses than Derek Brunson. If you include the bonuses that Derek Brunson's been on the end of, then maybe he outranks Jouban again for potential on paper. And again, Derek Brunson's more of a gatekeeper, so it's not like you can even argue or hold that against Jouban. I figure Jouban is a similar model, but I'll even give the nod to matchups like that, a very similar model, whereas Heinisch, like Grant, although I'm bigger on Heinisch than Grant as far as his ceiling within his weight class and all that, but still, it's a contender series guy. We've seen that formula been used and been very successful. So although I still do agree, hence why I picked 241, I feel that's a bad example, because the example you cited for being so excited, pumping up 241, that was the exact same matchup.
No, it's not. It's not the same matchup. I mentioned two guys ranked in the top 15. You're talking about Alan Jouban as an exciting fighter. I mean, Alan Jouban is the only person in history to fight Mike Perry and not have a good, not be, and actually be considered a boring fight. I mean, so when is Alan Jouban an exciting fighter?
Well, middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight top 15 is different than the rest of the divisions. Especially, again, you just made a big argument as how stacked welterweight is. Where did Jouban and Grant fall in? Yeah,
they wouldn't even be in the top 40.
Again, due to sample size, it's such a huge division. It's more of a stacked division. Middleweight's like a slightly more athletic heavyweight, because it's heavyweights who wanted to cut weight. I mean, it doesn't take you as much to get into those rankings. And again, even though they are in the rankings, are we talking about, even as high on Heinisch, are we talking about him being title shot anytime soon? No, but it's a good matchup to set him up because you got that name. And although it didn't quite work for Grant, it was still a good matchup to give him that opportunity to go, hey, I know Jouban, and he knocks him out. Boom, he's in the spot.
Cool. My last point. He just said that middleweight is not that. So ranked at middleweight is not that important because it's not as deep as welterweight. Well, then let me go back to the point he just said. He just said that was a stacked card. Well, the co-main event was the middleweight champion of the world, so it shouldn't matter that much because it's middleweight. The card that he's saying is so great is middleweight, and the card I'm saying is a welterweight matchup between Nate Diaz and Anthony Pettis.
To be fair, I didn't say it was so great. I say it's not. It's easy. It's easier to get in. It's not as hard.
It's like listen. It's like
it might sound cruel, but it's true.
It's kind of like this. Like making the finals is easy to get in for you, but like winning the finals is pretty much impossible.
All right. See, much like the real world versus road rules challenge shows, anything can happen. There's twists and turns in this program that can happen at any time. So when it comes to picking a winner here, I'm not going to pick it. I'm not picking a winner right now. Instead, I'm going to turn it over to Judge John Franklin himself, who's been hanging out in the background, waiting for his moment to come on camera, to come on this program and make his presence felt and take the pressure and weight off my shoulders. I thank you, Judge John Franklin. What is the verdict, sir?
Okay, let's get into a few things here. First of all, I was the person that Mike was talking about who has not been posting his podcast on time. And let me tell you something, I'm nervous. Because the reason why I'm nervous is because Keith and Dan brought the fire this week. And if Dan wanted to, Keith would probably take him to replace me. There's no loyalty in this game. So, I mean, they both did fantastic. They did amazing. Okay, everything that Dan said, was fantastic. I'm going to get killed for my bias in this. Mike put me right into a situation where I have a built-in bias. But in as much as I appreciate Dan Tom, who went on a former podcast of mine, the Splendid Science of MMA podcast, a fantastic listen, by the way. It's in the archives of the Cage Side Press podcast. Dan breaks down his process. We talk about trends in MMA. It's a really, really great podcast. So hit the archives, in the words of Mike Heck. I'm still giving the win to my man Keith Schilling because I honestly think he earned it. I really do. I am biased. I do want to hear what Dan has to say before he leaves. I think we should give him some FaceTime as well. Davidson was an absolute car accident this week, and Dan and Keith still survived that. It's like they were in the back seat. Davidson was driving, and by some grace of God, they walked away from this thing and still salvaged a career and a life. I saw Dan. Dan had his hand on his mouse. Like, do I just leave this thing at times? He's like, do I just click out and tell them that something happened technically? There's a few times where he was like, I hear something, and then Davidson would go, and he's like, I got to get out of this. I got a career to salvage. So I give the win to Keith Schilling. I am biased, but I was not biased in this time. I thought Keith really handled the finals well. And Dan represented himself as well. And if we ever want to do an MMA crossfire, these two guys are the ones that should host it. So there you have it. Back to you, Mike.
And in terms of how I would have ruled it, I think Keith had the advantage. I think going second was a big advantage for him because, full disclosure, I present the questions for the regulation rounds ahead of time. Nobody knows what the final question is going to be, ever. Nobody ever knows. Maybe John Franklin knows because I have to let him know for the YouTube page, and I forgot to tell you, so I guess I suck too. But nobody knows. So Dan was kind of thrown off. Keith had time to go and tapology the card and go through it fight by fight, pulling a Craig Allen, and it worked out in his favor. I would have given it to Keith, but I will say this. If the conversation between Keith and Dan continued on for another 3 or 4 minutes, things could have changed very quickly because Dan was – you ever see that college sprinting race where they're running around the track and one guy's running, he's got a big lead, and then he starts like gallivanting, like, woohoo, I'm going to win the gold medal. And then the other guy just runs by him and crosses the finish line first. We almost had that moment here on the program, but I agree with John's pick of Keith Schilling. So Keith, you have 30 seconds to talk about whatever it is you would like to talk about. Good, bad, indifferent in the sport of mixed martial arts. Don't plug your stuff because we already know about it. Although I'm going to do this for you. Check out his Contender Series previews on SureDog. They're pretty fantastic.
Well, I mean, I like your analogy of the sprinting thing, but it was really more like when the guy is wrestling the referee after he got knocked out. Like that's what Dan was trying to do. No, listen, congrats to Dan. Congrats to Dan. He made it further in this show than MMA Junkie Radio did. So congrats on that, brother. No, I'll check it out. I actually threw that to Dan first to say, make sure, hey, I'm going to do this joke. 100 all love. Listen, I just want to talk about MMA Junkie Radio. Dan's been on that for a while. Those guys were one of the very best shows in the history of any podcasting in any sport. I think the world of MMA is better because of the 3 men that did that job. So congrats to Dan and all those guys over MMA Junkie Radio. But also, I want to give some love to someone else. I do the Contender Series previews. One thing I like to do is look to interviews. And one of the people that's been killing the interviews is the man himself, Mike Heck. Mike Heck's been killing interviews, and that's because he's doing this full time now. So congrats to him, man, for taking that big leap, doing this big time. He's killing it. He's going to be one of the biggest names. I think he already is one of the biggest names in MMA media, but I think he's going to continue to be one of the biggest names. So congrats to Mike, too.
Keith, you already won. You already got the win. But I appreciate that nonetheless. Now that my kid's going back to daycare tomorrow, thank God, after 2 weeks off and being sick for, so basically he was home for like 18 days. I have 12 interviews booked for tomorrow, so I have a lot of catch up to do. But Dan, Tom, I appreciate you coming on as well. I want to give you the floor, Judge John Franklin ruled on it. So I'm going to give you the floor to speak to the folks as well.
Hey, Judge John, don't feel bad about your pick, man. I agree. I'm not a sore loser anyways, to be honest, but no, I legitimately agree. I'm doing this on my phone. I probably should have done it on my like laptop because I'm like, you try to cheat and like look at your phone and stuff. I had none of that. So that last question, man, I was really just kind of bent over like Dazed and Confused, and fucking Keith over there was like Affleck just giving it to me and shit, O'Banion style. But anyways, guys, no, I honestly want to say thank you, Mike. I followed you and been aware about your work, and hosting this show. I love your beats and the shots you take on Keith. the Sunday Morning Corner, man. John, you know I love podcasting with you, man. I love what you're doing on there. I've been meaning to tell you that, by the way. I've been seeing you do the show and being consistent with it. And I don't know if you're still doing it, Keith. Of course, Keith, you do great work, man. I'm probably going to be messaging you about something, actually, by the way.
Thanks, man.
You do great work, of course, over at Sure Dog. I don't know if you're still doing because, again, I'm a subscriber to the Loudmouth channel here. I don't know if you're doing those MMA yesterdays. I'm still like in the 20s, but you kill it on that, dude. You are awesome, man.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, man.
All right. What a nice moment. I feel like a virtual group hug is warranted here. We should bring back Davidson.
It's because David's too nice. He must be like a little Canadian in him. He's just a nice guy. Is it a Hawaiian Canada thing? Like that connection?
I don't know. I feel like I have a weird connection with Canadians, but I always just chalk that up to Canadians being nice, to be honest. I don't chalk it up to me or my people.
Great show. I'm looking forward to UFC 241 coming up on Saturday. I know everybody else is as well. And that's it, everybody. So thank you for listening, subscribing. Make sure you subscribe to the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network to get all those great shows that I discussed before. For Davidson, Craig, Dan, and Keith, and Judge John Franklin, I am Mike Heck. We'll see you next week as we go back between the links. Enjoy the fights this weekend, everybody.